Good evening, my friends. I am Father Vincent Lampert, a priest of the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, called to the ministry of exorcism, a path I've walked since my training in Rome under seasoned exorcists. Tonight I share with you a true story from my service, one that unfolded in the year 2007 in the shadowed heart of Detroit, Michigan. Before I begin, a note. The names of those involved have been changed to protect their identities, but the events I recount are real, rooted in the battle between light and darkness. This is the story of a young woman named Laura, a soul caught in the grip of a malevolent force, and the fight to free her from the clutches of a demon known as Abaddon, the king of the abyss spoken of in the book of Revelation. Let me take you to Detroit, a city of resilience and ruin, where the ghosts of industry linger in rusted factories and crumbling buildings. In the shadow of the Michigan Central Station, a once grand structure now abandoned, its towering arches and broken windows stand like a monument to forgotten dreams. The station, built in the early 20th century, was a hub of travel and ambition, but by 2007, it was a hollow shell, its underground tunnels stretching like veins beneath the city. It was in these tunnels that the story begins, where the wind carried more than dust, it carried whispers of something ancient, something malevolent. Laura Bennett was a woman of 34 years, a freelance journalist with a sharp mind and a restless heart. She lived in a modest apartment, no more than a mile from the station, in a neighborhood where the hum of traffic mingled with the silence of decay. Laura was raised Catholic, baptized in the faith, but she had drifted from the church after her father's death when she was just a teenager. His passing left a wound in her soul, a void she filled with questions and a relentless pursuit of truth through her writing. She was drawn to forgotten places, the kind of locations where history whispers to those who listen. The Michigan Central Station was her latest obsession, its abandoned halls and tunnels a canvas for her next article. She wanted to uncover its secrets, to give voice to the stories trapped within its walls. But some secrets, my friends, are not meant to be disturbed. I first heard of Laura through a man named Marcus Reed, a devout Catholic and a mechanic who worked in a small garage not far from Laura's apartment. Marcus was a man of simple faith, the kind who carried a rosary in his pocket and prayed before every meal. He and Laura had been friends for years, their bond forged in the shared struggles of life in Detroit. Marcus told me that Laura had always been curious, but in the weeks leading up to my involvement, she had changed. She spoke of strange winds in the tunnels beneath the station, winds that didn't behave like any natural breeze. They seemed to follow her, swirling around her as she explored the darkened passages, carrying sounds that chilled her to the bone. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the echoes of an empty place playing tricks. But then the winds began to form words, faint and indistinct at first, like a distant conversation. Over time, they grew clearer, and Marcus said Laura swore she heard her name, Laura. Laura whispered in a voice that was not human. Now, I've learned in my ministry that the demonic often works through subtlety, creeping into the cracks of a wounded soul. Laura's wound was her father's death, a loss that left her searching for meaning, for answers the world couldn't provide. The demon, Abaddon, whose name we would later uncover, is no ordinary spirit. In the book of Revelation, chapter 9, verse 11, Abaddon is called the angel of the abyss, the king of a legion of torments, a force of destruction that preys on despair and the hunger for ultimate truth. This was no coincidence. The tunnels beneath the Michigan Central Station were not just forgotten passages. They were a place where darkness lingered, where something ancient had been stirred. Laura's explorations began innocently enough. She would venture into the tunnels with a flashlight and a notebook, sketching the graffiti-covered walls and jotting down notes about the station's history. The tunnels were a maze, stretching for miles beneath the city, their concrete walls damp and cold, the air heavy with the scent of mold and rust. She told Marcus that the deeper she went, the stranger the air felt, as if it were alive, pressing against her skin. One night, about 3 weeks before Marcus reached out to me, Laura found something that changed everything. In a forgotten alcove, half buried in rubble, she uncovered a bronze plaque about 2 feet wide, etched with the image of an eagle. Its eyes were inlaid with red stones that seemed to glow faintly in the beam of her flashlight. Beneath the eagle was a single word, carved in deep, precise letters, Abaddon. I've seen many things in my years as an exorcist, objects that carry a weight beyond their material form. This plaque was one of them. Laura, driven by curiosity, reached out and touched it. The moment her fingers brushed the cold metal, she felt a jolt, like a spark of electricity, and the air around her seemed to thicken. The wind in the tunnel grew louder, swirling around her, and she heard her name again, Laura, clearer this time, as if spoken by a chorus of voices, none of them kind. She stumbled back, her heart pounding, but the plaque seemed to draw her in, its red eyes fixed on her like a predator watching its prey. She didn't tell Marcus about the plaque right away, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, she dreamed of a figure with wings, standing in a void of darkness, its voice promising her the truth of the world if she would only let it in. In my training in Rome, I learned that the demonic often uses promises of knowledge or power to lure the vulnerable. Laura was vulnerable not because she was weak, but because her heart was heavy with unanswered questions. The death of her father had left her grappling with the meaning of life, and Abaddon, cunning as it was, saw an opportunity. Over the next few days, Laura's behavior began to shift. Marcus noticed she was staying up late, typing furiously on her laptop, filling pages with symbols and phrases she couldn't explain. She described visions of storms and chasms, of a world unraveling into chaos. Her apartment, once tidy, became a mess of papers and books, all centered on the station and its history. Marcus tried to talk to her, but she was distant, her eyes hollow, as if she were listening to something he couldn't hear. One evening, Marcus visited Laura and found her sitting in the dark, her apartment cold despite the warm September air. The windows were closed, yet a faint breeze moved through the room, rustling the papers on her desk. She was muttering to herself, words Marcus didn't understand, words that sounded like a language he'd never heard. When he called her name, she turned to him, her face pale, and for a moment her eyes seemed to flicker with a light that wasn't her own. "It knows me, Marcus," she said, her voice low and trembling. "It knows my name." That was when Marcus knew something was terribly wrong. He'd heard stories of possession, of spirits that could twist a person's mind and soul, and though he wasn't sure what was happening, he felt a chill that went beyond the physical. He called me the next day, his voice steady but urgent, asking for help. I'd been an exorcist since 2005, appointed by my bishop to serve in a ministry that many don't understand. My training in Rome, under the guidance of men who had faced the darkest forces, taught me to approach each case with caution, prayer, and discernment. The Church is clear, not every disturbance is demonic, and we must rule out mental illness or natural causes before proceeding. But Marcus's description of Laura, the winds, the voices, the sudden change in her demeanor, raised red flags. I agreed to travel to Detroit to meet Laura and assess the situation. I packed my ritual, the Roman ritual for exorcism, along with holy water, a crucifix, and a relic of Saint Benedict, a protector against evil. I knew even then that this would not be a simple case. When I arrived in Detroit, the city felt heavy, as if the weight of its history pressed down on every street. The Michigan Central Station loomed in the distance, its silhouette stark against the gray sky. Marcus met me at Laura's apartment, a small second-floor unit in a brick building that had seen better days. The air inside was stale, and the faint sound of wind seemed to follow us, even though the windows were shut tight. Laura was sitting on her couch, staring at a blank wall, her hands clutching a notebook filled with strange symbols, circles, lines, and shapes that resembled no language I recognized. I introduced myself, speaking softly, but she barely acknowledged me. "Father," Marcus said, his voice low, "she's been like this for days. She doesn't eat, doesn't sleep, and the wind, it's always there." I began with a simple prayer, the prayer to St. Michael, asking for protection. As I spoke, the air in the room grew colder, and a low hum, like the sound of distant thunder, filled the space. Laura's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto mine. "You can't stop it," she said, her voice not entirely her own, deeper. with an edge that sent a shiver down my spine. I've heard that tone before, in other cases a tone that carries the weight of something ancient and cruel. I sprinkled holy water on the floor, and Laura flinched as if burned, her hands gripping the couch until her knuckles turned white. "It's calling me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's calling me to the abyss." That moment confirmed what I suspected. This was no ordinary disturbance. Laura was under the influence of something dark, something that had found a foothold in her soul through her grief and her search for truth. The name Abaddon, carved on that plaque, was no coincidence. It was a name I knew from Scripture, a name that carried the weight of destruction. I told Marcus we needed to act quickly, to gather more information about the station and its history, and to seek permission from the Archdiocese of Detroit for a formal exorcism. The wind in the tunnels, the whispers, the plaque, they were all signs of a presence that had been awakened, and Laura was its target. This is where the story begins, my friends, in the shadows of a forgotten station, where a young woman's search for truth opened a door to something far older, far darker than she could have imagined. The battle was just beginning, and it would test the strength of faith, the power of prayer, and the courage to face the abyss. I ask you to keep Laura in your prayers, for her story is a reminder that the demonic preys on our deepest wounds, but the light of Christ is stronger still. Let me continue in the next part with what we discovered in those tunnels and the fight to save a soul from the grip of Abaddon. After my initial visit to Laura's apartment, where the air grew cold and her voice carried a tone not her own, I knew we were dealing with a force that required careful discernment. The Church teaches us to approach such cases with caution, ruling out natural explanations before naming the demonic. But the plaque Laura found, etched with the name Abaddon and an eagle with glowing red eyes, was a clue that pointed to something ancient and deliberate. I've learned in my ministry, trained in Rome under seasoned exorcists, that objects can become conduits for evil, especially when tied to rituals or acts of defiance against God. Laura's encounter with the plaque was no accident. It was a doorway and something it stepped through. Marcus Reed, Laura's friend and a devout Catholic, was shaken but resolute. He met me the morning after my first encounter with Laura, his rosary clutched tightly in his calloused hands. We stood outside her apartment building, the looming silhouette of the Michigan Central Station visible in the distance, its broken windows like empty eyes watching us. Marcus told me more about Laura's descent. In the days following her discovery of the plaque, she had become consumed with the station's history, spending hours in the library, poring over old blueprints and newspaper clippings. She spoke of dreams, vivid, terrifying visions of a winged figure standing in a void, its voice promising her answers to questions she had carried since her father's death. "It's like she's chasing something she can't name," Marcus said, his voice heavy with worry, "but it's chasing her too." Laura's dreams were not mere imagination. In my experience, the demonic often uses dreams to plant seeds of obsession, exploiting a person's deepest desires or wounds. Laura's wound was the loss of her father, a grief that had left her searching for meaning in a world that felt empty. Abaddon, as Scripture describes in Revelation chapter 9, verse 11, is a destroyer, a king of the abyss who thrives on despair. Its promise of absolute truth was a lure. Tailored to Laura's hunger for understanding, she began to change in ways Marcus couldn't ignore. She stopped eating, her once neat apartment now a chaos of papers scrawled with symbols, spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that seemed to pulse with meaning. Marcus showed me one of her notebooks, its pages filled with phrases like "the storm is coming and the abyss sees all." Most chilling was a single line, written over and over in tight, frantic handwriting: "Abaddon knows my name." What troubled me most was Laura's sudden ability to speak in a language she had never studied. Marcus recounted an evening when he found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, muttering words that sounded like Greek, not the modern kind, but the ancient tongue of Scripture and philosophers. It wasn't her voice, Marcus told me, his eyes wide. It was like someone else was speaking through her, slow and deliberate, like they were tasting every word. I've encountered this before, demonic knowledge, where a spirit grants a person access to languages or facts beyond their natural ability. It's a sign of influence, a way to dazzle and dominate the soul. Laura, a woman with no formal training in Greek, was reciting phrases that Marcus later learned through a friend who studied classics were fragments of ancient prayers twisted into something dark. I returned to Laura's apartment that afternoon, carrying my ritual and a vial of holy water blessed by my bishop. The air inside was heavier than before, thick with a stillness that felt alive. Laura was at her desk, typing furiously on her laptop, her fingers moving faster than seemed natural. The screen glowed with a document filled with the same symbols from her notebook, interspersed with descriptions of storms and chasms. I called her name softly, but she didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head, as if listening to something far away, and whispered, "It's in the tunnels. It's waiting." I placed my crucifix on the desk, a simple wooden one I've carried since my ordination, and began to pray the Litany of the Saints. The moment I invoked St. Michael, the room shook, not violently, but enough to rattle the windows. Laura's head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing, and she hissed, "You're too late, priest!" This was not Laura speaking. In my training, I was taught to recognize the signs of demonic influence, aversion to holy objects, unnatural knowledge, and a voice that carries the weight of malice. Laura displayed all three. I sprinkled holy water on the floor, and she recoiled, her hands clawing at the air as if fighting an invisible force. "It knows my pain," she said, her voice breaking into a sob before shifting to that deeper, guttural tone. "It knows my father." That was the moment I understood Abaddon's strategy. It had latched onto Laura's grief, using her loss as a wedge to pry open her soul. The demonic always seeks a foothold, a crack in the human heart, and Laura's was her unresolved sorrow. I knew we needed more information about the plaque and the tunnels. Marcus suggested we contact Dr. Emily Watson, a local historian who had studied Detroit's urban decay. Emily was a woman of science, skeptical of the supernatural, but she agreed to meet us at a coffee shop near the station. Over steaming cups of black coffee, she shared what she knew about the Michigan Central Station. Built in 1913, it was a marvel of architecture designed to rival the great terminals of New York and Chicago. But by the 1980s, it had fallen into disrepair, its tunnels sealed off after years of neglect. Emily had heard rumors of strange activity in the tunnels, workers reporting whispers, lights flickering without power, and a pervasive sense of unease. She dismissed them as urban legends, but the mention of the plaque caught her attention. "An eagle with red eyes?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "That's not in any records I've seen." Emily agreed to join us in exploring the tunnels, bringing her expertise to uncover the plaque's origins. We entered the station the next day, armed with flashlights and a map of the underground passages. The tunnels were a labyrinth, their walls stained with water and time, the air thick with the scent of decay. As we descended, the temperature dropped, though it was a warm September day above ground. The wind Laura had described was there, faint at first like a sigh, but growing stronger the deeper we went. It wasn't a natural breeze, it moved in pulses, as if breathing, and it carried a sound, low and rhythmic, like a chant. Marcus clutched his rosary, his lips moving in silent prayer, while Emily scanned the walls with her flashlight, searching for clues. We found the alcove where Laura had discovered the plaque, its bronze surface glinting in the beam of my light. The eagle's red eyes seemed to follow us, and the word Abaddon was etched with a precision that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. Emily traced the letters with her finger, careful not to touch them, and said, "This isn't from the station's construction. It's too specific, too intentional." She suspected it was tied to a group or event not recorded in official history, perhaps a secret society or a forgotten incident. I felt the weight of the plaque's presence, a heaviness that went beyond its physical form. I sprinkled holy water on it, and the air around us seemed to tighten, the wind growing sharper, almost cutting. "We need to leave," I said, my voice firm. "This is no place for us right now." And said, back at the coffee shop, Emily promised to dig deeper into the station's history, focusing on any reports of rituals or unexplained events. Marcus and I returned to Laura's apartment, where we found her standing at her window, staring at the station. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, and she was muttering again, this time in a language that sounded like Greek but twisted, as if mocking the sacred. I placed my crucifix on her shoulder, and she screamed a sound that was both human and not, echoing through the small apartment. The wind outside howled, though the sky was clear, and I knew we were running out of time. I contacted the Archdiocese of Detroit that evening, explaining the situation and requesting permission for a formal exorcism. The church requires careful evaluation, and I provided every detail: the plaque, the dreams, the unnatural knowledge, and Laura's aversion to holy objects. While we waited, Marcus stayed with Laura, praying the rosary and keeping her from the tunnels. I spent the night in prayer, asking for the intercession of Saint Benedict and the Blessed Virgin, knowing that the battle ahead would test us all. The wind outside my hotel room grew louder, carrying that same chant-like hum, and I felt the presence of Abaddon, watching, waiting, as if daring me to step into its domain. This, my friends, was only the beginning of the fight. The tunnels held secrets we had yet to uncover, and Laura's soul hung in the balance. The demonic is patient, cunning, and relentless, but so is the power of Christ through his church. In the next part, I will share how we face the darkness head-on, with faith as our shield and prayer as our sword. Keep Laura in your prayers, for her story reminds us that even in the abyss, God's mercy is greater still. The morning after my second visit to Laura's apartment, I stood with Marcus Reed outside a small church in Detroit, the Most Holy Trinity, where the air felt cleaner, as if the presence of the Blessed Sacrament held the darkness at bay. Marcus was shaken, his hands trembling as he recounted the previous night. Laura had grown more erratic, pacing her apartment and muttering about a storm that would swallow the city. Her eyes, he said, had a strange glow at times, like embers in a dying fire. "Father," Marcus whispered, "I've prayed my whole life, but I've never felt anything like this. It's like something's watching us, waiting." I placed a hand on his shoulder, reminding him of the words of St. Paul in Ephesians chapter 6. Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. Marcus's faith was his strength, and I urged him to hold fast to it. My training in Rome had taught me that demonic influence thrives on fear and doubt, but it flees before the authority of Christ's church. I had seen Laura's reaction to holy water, her recoil, the hiss that wasn't her own, and I knew we were beyond natural explanations. The plaque with Abaddon's name, the wind in the tunnels, and Laura's transformation pointed to a deliberate act of evil, one that had taken root in her grief over her father's death. I told Marcus we needed to act swiftly, but the church requires discernment. An exorcism is not a ritual to be undertaken lightly. It demands approval from the bishop and a thorough investigation to ensure the presence is truly demonic. I had already contacted the Archdiocese of Detroit, and while awaiting their response, I decided to return to Laura's apartment to assess her condition further and to pray for her protection. When we arrived, the scene was worse than I had feared. Laura was sitting in the corner of her living room, surrounded by papers strewn across the floor, each marked with the same strange symbols I had seen before: spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that seemed to writhe under the light. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and a faint breeze moved through the room, though every window was sealed. Her laptop was open, its screen filled with text that alternated between English and what looked like ancient Greek, describing a great unveiling and a chasm that speaks. I approached her cautiously, holding my crucifix, and began to pray the prayer to St. Michael. Laura's head tilted unnaturally, her eyes locking onto mine, and she spoke in that deep, guttural voice I had heard before. "You cannot bind what is already free, priest," she said, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't hers. "The abyss is open." I sprinkled holy water around her, forming a circle on the floor, and she reacted violently. She lunged forward, knocking a lamp from the table, its glass shade shattering against the wall. The shards flew toward me, one grazing my forehead, leaving a thin cut that stung but didn't deter me. Blood trickled down, and I wiped it away, continuing the prayer. Laura's body trembled, her hands clawing at the air, and for a moment, her voice softened, pleading. "Help me, Father," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears before the other voice returned, mocking. "She belongs to me." This was a classic sign of possession, the alternation between the person's true self and the entity's control. I've seen it in other cases where the soul fights to surface only to be pulled back into the darkness. Marcus, standing by the door, was praying the rosary, his voice steady despite the chaos. I instructed him to call for medical help, as Laura's physical state was deteriorating. She hadn't eaten in days, and her body was weak from lack of sleep. But I knew this was not just a medical issue. The wound on my forehead required 6 stitches later that day, but it was a small price to pay for the clarity it brought. Laura was not merely troubled. She was under the influence of something ancient and malevolent, something that knew her pain and used it as a weapon. I stepped outside to call the Archdiocese again, urging them to expedite the permission for an exorcism. The secretary assured me that the bishop was reviewing my report, but these processes take time, as the church must ensure no mistake is made. While we waited, Marcus suggested we learn more about the plaque and its connection to the station. Dr. Emily Watson, the historian we had met, was already digging into archives at the Detroit Public Library. She called us that afternoon, her voice tense with excitement. "I found something," she said. "It's not in the official records, but there are references in old journals from the 1920s. A group of engineers working on the station's tunnels were part of a secret society, one that dabbled in occult practices. They believed they could harness supernatural forces to perfect their designs. Emily's research pointed to a ritual gone wrong, one that invoked Abaddon in hopes of gaining forbidden knowledge. The ritual failed, and a tunnel collapse killed 5 workers, an event buried in the city's history. The plaque, she suspected, was a remnant of that ritual, a marker left behind to anchor the demon's presence. This revelation was chilling, but not surprising. In my ministry, I've encountered objects tied to occult practices, amulets, books, even statues that become conduits for demonic activity. The plaque, with its eagle and red eyes, was such an object, deliberately placed to invite or trap Abaddon's influence. Emily agreed to join us again in the tunnels, this time to locate any other artifacts that might shed light on the ritual. We entered the station at dusk, the sky painted red over the crumbling towers. The tunnels felt different now, the air thicker, the wind sharper, as if aware of our presence. Emily led us to the alcove where Laura had found the plaque, and we searched the surrounding area, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. What we found was a small chamber hidden behind a collapsed wall, its entrance barely wide enough to squeeze through. Inside, the air was stale, and the walls were marked with faded symbols similar to those in Laura's notebook. At the center of the chamber was a stone slab etched with the same eagle motif as the plaque. Emily examined it, her hands trembling. "This is a ritual site," she whispered. They were trying to summon something. I sprinkled holy water on the slab, and the wind in the tunnel surged, a low growl echoing around us. Marcus clutched his rosary, his prayers growing louder, and I felt the weight of Abaddon's gaze, as if it were watching from the shadows. We left the chamber quickly, knowing we were not yet equipped to confront what lingered there. Back at the church, I met with Marcus and Emily to plan our next steps. The Archdiocese had promised a response within days, and I urged them to prepare for a formal exorcism. I also advised Marcus to stay with Laura, to keep her from the tunnels, and to surround her with prayer. That night I returned to my hotel, my mind heavy with the weight of what we faced. The wind outside howled, carrying that same rhythmic chant, and I knew Abaddon was not idle. It was testing us, probing for weakness, as demons often do. In my prayers that night, I called upon Saint Benedict, whose medal I carried, and the Blessed Virgin, whose intercession has never failed me. I asked for strength, for wisdom, and for protection for Laura, Marcus, and Emily. The battle was escalating, and the tunnels of Michigan Central Station were no longer just a relic of the past. They were a battlefield where the soul of a woman hung in the balance. My friends, hold fast to your faith, for the story continues with the uncovering of deeper secrets and the preparation for a confrontation that would test us all. Keep Laura in your prayers as we move toward the heart of the abyss. The day after our discovery in the hidden chamber, I met Marcus Reed and Dr. Emily Watson at a small diner near the Most Holy Trinity Church, a place where the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation offered a brief respite from the oppressive weight of our task. Marcus was weary, his eyes shadowed from sleepless nights watching over Laura. He told me she had grown quieter, but not in a comforting way. Her silence was heavy, as if she were listening to something we couldn't hear. Emily, her historian's curiosity undimmed, despite the eerie findings in the tunnel, had spent the night digging through obscure records at the Detroit Historical Society. Over coffee, she shared what she had uncovered, her voice low to avoid drawing attention from the other patrons. The journal she found, written by a laborer who worked on the station in the 1920s, described a group of engineers who called themselves the Order of the Saffron Veil. They were not content with mere blueprints and steel. They believed they could tap into a higher knowledge, a power that would make their work immortal. The laborer, a devout Catholic, wrote of their secret meetings in the tunnels, where they chanted in a language he didn't understand and used symbols drawn in chalk and blood. The bronze plaque, with its eagle and the name Abaddon, was their creation, a focal point for their ritual to summon what they called the Keeper of Truths. Emily's voice trembled as she read a passage from the journal. They thought they could control it, but it turned on them. The ground shook and the tunnel fell. 5 men were lost, and the air screamed with their names. The collapse was blamed on faulty engineering, but the laborer believed it was a punishment, a warning from God. This account aligned with what I had learned in Rome about demonic entities like Abaddon, described in Revelation chapter 9, verse 11, as the king of the abyss. Such spirits thrive on human pride, especially the desire to know what is beyond mortal reach. The engineer's ritual had invited Abaddon into the station, and the plaque was its anchor, a physical link to the spiritual realm. I suspected that Laura's touch had reawakened this dormant presence, giving it a new vessel in her grief-stricken soul. Emily's research also uncovered a chilling detail. The laborer's journal mentioned a second artifact, a book hidden in the tunnels, containing the words used to bind and banish the entity. If we could find it, it might hold the key to weakening Abaddon's grip. Determined to locate this book, we returned to the tunnels that afternoon, armed with flashlights, holy water, and Marcus's unwavering prayers. The air was colder than before, the wind sharper, carrying a low hum that seemed to vibrate in our bones. We navigated the labyrinthine passages, guided by Emily's map, until we reached the hidden chamber. The stone slab with the eagle motif stood silent, but the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in the flickering light. Emily searched the chamber, running her hands along the cracked concrete, while I prayed the prayer to St. Michael, my crucifix held high. Marcus stayed close, his rosary beads clicking softly as he recited the sorrowful mysteries. As Emily pried at a loose stone in the wall, the wind surged, a sudden gust that knocked her flashlight from her hand. The beam spun wildly, casting shadows that seemed to twist into shapes, wings, claws, eyes. I sprinkled holy water, and the air grew heavy, as if resisting my presence. Emily, undeterred, uncovered a small recess behind the stone, revealing a leather-bound book, its cover worn but marked with the same eagle symbol. She reached for it, but I stopped her, sensing a trap. "Let me," I said, blessing the book with holy water before touching it. The pages were brittle, written in a mix of Latin and Greek, with diagrams of the tunnels and incantations that twisted sacred prayers into something profane. One page described a ritual to banish Abaddon, performed by a priest after the collapse, but it warned that the plaque must be destroyed to sever the demon's tie to the physical world. We left the tunnel with the book, but the moment we stepped into the daylight, a scream echoed from the station. It was Laura. Marcus had left her with a neighbor, a kind woman who attended Mass daily, but Laura had slipped away, drawn back to the tunnels. We raced to her apartment, only to find the neighbor shaken, clutching a rosary. "She was fine one moment," the woman said. Then she started laughing, saying the abyss was calling her. We hurried to the station, entering the tunnels just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a blood-red glow. Deep in the tunnels, we found Laura standing before the bronze plaque, her flashlight discarded, her eyes fixed on the eagle's red stones. The wind swirled around her, a vortex of dust and debris, and her voice was not her own. "You cannot close what I have opened," she said, her words laced with malice. I stepped forward, crucifix in hand, and began the rite of exorcism, commanding the spirit to name itself. Abaddon, it growled through Laura's lips. King of the locusts, Lord of the abyss. Emily, clutching the book, whispered that we needed to destroy the plaque, but before we could act, Laura moved with unnatural speed. She grabbed a shard of broken glass from the tunnel floor and lunged at Emily, slashing her shoulder. Blood welled up, staining Emily's coat, and she staggered back, gasping in pain. Marcus pulled Emily away, pressing his jacket against her wound, while I continued the prayers, my voice steady despite the chaos. Laura's body trembled, her eyes flickering between her own fear and the demon's rage. She is mine, Abaddon snarled, but I invoked the name of Christ, holding the crucifix aloft. The wind howled, shaking the tunnel, and Laura collapsed, her body limp but breathing. We carried her out, rushing Emily to a hospital where she received stitches for a deep gash. The doctors said she'd recover, but Emily was shaken, her skepticism replaced by a quiet fear. Marcus, his face pale, clutched the book we had found, its pages now a lifeline in our fight. That night, I met with Marcus at the church, where we prayed before the Blessed Sacrament. The book confirmed that Abaddon had been banished once before, but the plaque's survival allowed its return. Destroying it would require a full exorcism, performed in the presence of the plaque, with Laura as the focal point of the demon's influence. The Archdiocese had yet to grant permission, but I knew we couldn't wait long. Laura was weakening, her body and soul stretched thin by Abaddon's grip. I called the bishop's office again, emphasizing the urgency, and prepared for what lay ahead. The tunnels were no longer just a relic of Detroit's past, they were a battleground, and Abaddon was ready to fight. My friends, the darkness was closing in, but the light of faith held firm. The book, the plaque, and Laura's soul were intertwined, and the next steps would demand courage and sacrifice. Keep Laura in your prayers, for the story continues with the church's response and the gathering storm beneath the city. The abyss may whisper, but Christ's voice is louder still. The day after Laura's attack on Emily, I sat in the rectory of Most Holy Trinity Church, the air heavy with the scent of incense and old wood. Marcus Reed was with me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, his eyes red from lack of sleep. He had stayed by Laura's side through the night, praying the rosary as she lay in her apartment, restrained by a trusted parishioner to keep her from returning to the tunnels. Laura's condition had worsened. She barely spoke now, her body trembling as if caught in a storm only she could feel. The book we found in the tunnels, with its Latin and Greek incantations, confirmed that Abaddon's hold was tied to the bronze plaque, a relic of the engineer's occult ritual. Destroying it would be key, but such an act required the full weight of the church's authority through a formal exorcism. I had been in contact with the Archdiocese of Detroit for days, submitting detailed reports of Laura's symptoms, her aversion to holy objects, her knowledge of ancient languages, the unnatural wind that followed her, and the violent outburst that left Emily with stitches. The church is deliberate in these matters, as it must be. My training in Rome under experienced exorcists taught me that an exorcism is a sacred rite, not to be performed without discernment and approval. The bishop's office had been reviewing my request, consulting with theologians and psychologists to rule out mental illness or other causes. I understood the need for caution, but Laura's soul was at stake, and the urgency weighed heavily on me. That morning, I received a call from the chancellor of the Archdiocese. Father Lampert, he said, his voice calm but firm, the bishop has granted permission for a solemn exorcism. You are to proceed with utmost care under the guidance of the Roman ritual. This was the moment we had been waiting for, but it brought no relief, only a sober awareness of the battle ahead. I thanked the chancellor and asked for a priest to assist me, as the rite often requires support. The Archdiocese assigned Father Sophia Nguyen, a young but dedicated priest from a nearby parish, known for her deep faith and knowledge of Scripture. I met Father Nguyen that afternoon at the church, where we knelt before the Blessed Sacrament to prepare our hearts. She was small in stature, with a quiet demeanor, but her eyes burned with a resolve that reminded me of the saints. Father Vincent, she said, I've read about Abaddon in Revelation. It's a destroyer, but Christ is stronger. I nodded, grateful for her presence. and we spent an hour in prayer, invoking the intercession of St. Michael, St. Benedict, and the Blessed Virgin Mary. Our plan was to perform the exorcism in the tunnels near the bronze plaque where Abaddon's influence was strongest. The book we found suggested that the demon's tie to the physical world was rooted in that artifact, and confronting it there would give us the best chance to break its hold. But the tunnels were dangerous, unstable, dark, and filled with an unnatural presence. I contacted Marcus to ensure Laura could be safely transported to the station, and I asked Emily, now recovering from her injury, to provide any further insights from the book. Emily, though shaken, was determined to help. She met us at the church, her arm in a sling, and handed me a translated page from the book. It says the ritual must be performed at the heart of the abyss, she explained. That's the chamber with the plaque. But it warns of resistance Abaddon will fight to keep its claim. I reviewed the Roman ritual, ensuring every step was clear. The rite is a structured prayer, not a magic spell, grounded in the authority of Christ through his church. It begins with the litany of the saints, followed by scripture readings, prayers of protection, and commands to the demon to depart. I carried my ritual, a vial of holy water, a crucifix, and a relic of St. Benedict, each blessed for this purpose. Father Nguyen brought a stole and a copy of the gospel, her hands steady as she prepared. Marcus, though not a priest, insisted on joining us, his faith a beacon in the darkness. I cautioned him about the risks. Demonic entities often target those closest to the afflicted, but he was resolute. Laura's my friend, he said. I can't leave her to this thing. Abaddon. We spent the evening planning the logistics. The exorcism would take place the following night in the deepest part of the tunnels, where the air was thick with the demon's presence. We needed to secure Laura safely, as her physical strength under Abaddon's influence was unpredictable. I arranged for a sturdy chair and soft restraints, blessed by the church, to keep her from harming herself or others. The Archdiocese provided a medical team to stand by, ensuring Laura's physical safety as possession constrained the body to its limits. I also requested that the chamber be sealed off, with only Father Nguyen, Marcus, and myself present during the rite. The fewer people exposed to Abaddon's influence, the better. That night, I visited Laura's apartment to prepare her soul, if possible. She was lying on her couch, her body frail, but her eyes wild, darting as if seeing things we could not. I knelt beside her, placing a blessed medal of St. Benedict on her chest, and began to pray. In the name of Jesus Christ, I said, I command any evil spirit to reveal itself. Laura's body arched, a low growl escaping her lips, and the room grew cold, the wind outside rattling the windows. You have no power here, she hissed, her voice layered with another's. I continued praying, sprinkling holy water, and for a moment, Laura's true voice broke through. Father, I'm scared, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I reassured her, Laura, Christ is with you, hold on to him. But the other voice returned, mocking, she is mine, priest, the abyss claims its own. This fleeting glimpse of Laura's true self gave me hope. In my experience, the soul's fight against a demon is a sign of God's grace at work. I left her with Marcus and the parishioner, instructing them to pray without ceasing. Back at the church, Father Nguyen and I reviewed the ritual again, ensuring every word was committed to memory. We discussed the dangers. Abaddon, as a scriptural demon, was not a lesser spirit, but a power of destruction, capable of manipulating the environment and the minds of those around it. My training in Rome had prepared me for such cases, but each exorcism is unique, a test of faith and endurance. I reminded Father Nguyen of the Church's teaching. We do not fight alone, but with the authority of Christ and the intercession of the saints. As night fell, I stood alone in the church, gazing at the crucifix above the altar. The weight of what lay ahead was heavy, but I felt the strength of God's presence. The tunnels of Michigan Central Station were waiting, a place where the abyss had opened and Laura's soul hung in the balance. My friends, keep her in your prayers, for the story continues with the night of the exorcism, where faith, courage, and sacrifice would face the full fury of Abaddon. The darkness is real, but the light of Christ is greater still. The night of the exorcism, a cold October evening, carried a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the city itself held its breath. We gathered at Most Holy Trinity Church before heading to the Michigan Central Station, our hearts fortified by prayer. Father Sophia Nguyen, her stole draped over her shoulders, clutched her gospel book, her face calm but resolute. Marcus, his rosary in hand, had a quiet determination, though I could see the strain in his eyes from days of worry for Laura. I carried my ritual, a crucifix, holy water, and a relic of Saint Benedict, each blessed for this sacred task. The medical team, arranged by the Archdiocese, waited outside the station, ready to intervene if Laura's physical condition faltered. We had secured Laura in her apartment earlier, restrained gently to prevent her from harming herself, and now transported her to the tunnels in a parish van, her body trembling but silent, her eyes fixed on some unseen point. The Michigan Central Station loomed before us, its crumbling facade lit by the pale glow of a crescent moon. The tunnels beneath were our destination, specifically the chamber where the bronze plaque with Abaddon's name stood, its eagle and red eyes, a focal point of the demon's power. The book we found had warned that the heart of the abyss was where the ritual must take place, and I felt the weight of that truth as we descended. The air grew colder with each step, the concrete walls slick with moisture, and the wind always present began to stir, a low hum that seemed to pulse with intent. We carried Laura to a sturdy chair, blessed and placed near the plaque, securing her with soft restraints. Her head lolled, but her lips moved, muttering words in that twisted Greek, a mockery of sacred language. I began the rite of exorcism, as prescribed by the Roman ritual, with the litany of the saints. My voice echoed in the chamber, joined by Father Nguyen's steady responses. Saint Michael, pray for us. Saint Benedict, pray for us. Marcus stood nearby, praying the rosary, his beads clicking softly. The wind grew sharper, swirling around us, and the temperature plummeted, our breath visible in the dim light of our lanterns. Laura's body stiffened, her eyes snapping open, and they glowed not with light, but with a strange, reflective sheen, like headlights caught in a mirror. "You waste your time, priest," she growled, her voice layered with Abaddon's malice. "The abyss is eternal." Indifferent. I continued, undeterred, reading from Psalm 91. "You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day." Laura's body convulsed, her restraints straining, and the wind became a howl, shaking the chamber. Dust fell from the ceiling, and cracks in the walls seemed to pulse with faint light, as if the tunnel itself were alive. Father Nguyen held her gospel book aloft, reading from John chapter 1. "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Laura screamed, a sound that was both human and inhuman, and the plaque's red eyes seemed to flare, casting an eerie glow across her face. I sprinkled holy water on Laura and the plaque, commanding, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I order you, Abaddon, to name your purpose." The response was immediate and chilling. "She is mine," the voice roared through Laura's lips. Her pain called me. Her father's death opened the door. This was no surprise. My training in Rome had taught me that demons exploit grief, anger, or unhealed wounds. Laura's loss of her father had left her vulnerable, her search for meaning a crack through which Abaddon slithered. The demon continued, its voice dripping with contempt. "I will bring the storm to this city if you persist. The abyss will swallow all." The threat was real. In my experience, powerful demons like Abaddon can manipulate the environment, winds, sounds, even physical objects to instill fear. The tunnel shook again, a low rumble that sent pebbles skittering across the floor. Marcus faltered, his prayers pausing, and a sudden force pushed him back, slamming him against the wall. He gasped, clutching his wrist, which bent at an unnatural angle. "Keep praying," I told him, my voice firm. He nodded, pain etched on his face, and resumed the rosary, his voice trembling but unbroken. Father Nguyen stepped closer to Laura, her gospel book open, and began reading the Passion of Christ, her words a steady anchor in the chaos. Laura's convulsions grew violent, her body arching against the restraints, and the wind became a vortex, pulling at our clothes and extinguishing one of our lanterns. I raised my crucifix, commanding, "By the power of Jesus Christ, I bind you, Abaddon, and order you to release this woman." The demon laughed, a sound that echoed like thunder, and Laura's head twisted, her eyes locking onto mine. "You cannot bind what was invited," it said. "She sought the truth, and I am its keeper. This was a lie. A distortion demons twist truth to confuse and dominate." I pressed on, reciting the exorcism prayers, my voice steady despite the growing storm. The chamber felt alive, the walls trembling, and the plaque seemed to pulse, its red eyes glowing brighter. Father Nguyen sprinkled holy water, her hands steady, and Laura's screams grew desperate, a mix of the demon's rage and her own fear. I saw a flicker of her true self in her eyes, a plea for help, and I leaned closer, speaking directly to her soul. "Laura, hold fast to Christ. He is with you." For a moment, her trembling eased, but then Abaddon roared again, and Laura broke free of one restraint, her arm flailing. She lunged toward the plaque, as if drawn to it, and I grabbed her, pulling her back. The effort took all my strength, and Father Nguyen helped secure her again, her prayers never faltering. The demon's resistance was fierce, but this was expected. In Rome, I learned that a solemn exorcism is a battle of endurance, not a single act. Abaddon was no minor spirit. It was a scriptural demon, a power of destruction, and it would not yield easily. The wind grew stronger, carrying whispers of Laura's name, and the tunnel's cracks glowed with an unnatural light, as if the abyss itself were opening. Marcus, despite his injured wrist, continued praying, his faith a light in the darkness. I felt the weight of Abaddon's presence, a suffocating force that tested my resolve, but I clung to the authority of Christ, the same authority that has driven out demons for centuries. As the rite continued, Laura's body slumped, exhausted, and the wind slowed, though it did not stop. The demon was still present, its grip weakened but not broken. I knew we needed to reach the plaque itself to sever its tie to Abaddon, but Laura's sudden movement had shown us the danger of approaching it unprepared. We paused the rite, ensuring Laura was stable, and I signaled the medical team to check her vitals. Her pulse was weak but steady, her body drained from the struggle. Marcus, his wrist swollen, refused to leave, his prayers a constant hum. Father Nguyen and I exchanged a glance, knowing the next step would take us deeper into the abyss. My friends, the battle was far from over, but the power of Christ was at work. The tunnels held us in their grip, but faith held us stronger. Keep Laura in your prayers, for the story continues with a desperate chase and a confrontation that would demand everything we had. The abyss may roar, but Christ's victory is certain. The chamber beneath the Michigan Central Station was a cauldron of chaos as we paused the rite. Laura's body, slumped in the chair, was pale and trembling, her breath shallow but steady. The medical team, stationed just outside the tunnel, confirmed her vitals were stable, though her physical strength was fading. Marcus, clutching his injured wrist, stood firm, his rosary beads glinting in the dim light of our remaining lantern. Father Nguyen, her gospel book still open, whispered a prayer to the Blessed Virgin, her voice a quiet anchor in the oppressive air. The wind in the tunnel had slowed to a low moan, but the bronze plaque, with its eagle and glowing red eyes, seemed to pulse, as if daring us to continue. I knew we had to reach that plaque to sever Abaddon's tie to the physical world, but Laura's sudden break from her restraints had shown us the danger of acting too quickly. As we prepared to resume, a low rumble shook the tunnel, and Laura's eyes snapped open. Before we could react, she tore free of the remaining restraints with a strength that was not her own, her movements swift and unnatural. "The abyss calls," she screamed, her voice a mix of her own desperation and Abaddon's malice. She bolted deeper into the tunnel, toward a passage we hadn't explored, her bare feet slapping against the cold concrete. Father Nguyen and I exchanged a glance, and I nodded. "We follow her," I said, grabbing my crucifix and holy water. Marcus, despite his pain, insisted on coming, his faith outweighing his injury. The medical team stayed behind, unable to navigate the unstable tunnels, and we plunged into the darkness, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The passage twisted downward, narrower and more treacherous, the walls slick with moisture and marked with faint scratches, as if something had clawed its way through. The wind followed us, growing stronger, carrying whispers that seemed to mock our prayers. "Laura, Laura," the voices hissed, echoing off the walls. My training in Rome had prepared me for such moments. Demons often lure their victims to places of power, where their influence is strongest. The book we found had mentioned a heart of the abyss, and I feared Laura was being drawn to a place where Abaddon's presence was absolute. Father Nguyen recited Psalm 23 as we ran, her voice steady. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Marcus joined in, his voice strained but resolute, clutching his rosary like a lifeline. The passage opened into a new chamber, smaller but more ominous, its walls covered in the same symbols. Laura had scrawled in her notebook spirals, jagged lines, and shapes that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. At the center stood the bronze plaque, somehow moved from its original place, its red eyes glowing like embers. Laura was there, her body lurching unnaturally, as if suspended by invisible strings. The air around her shimmered, a vortex of wind and dust swirling like a storm. "You cannot stop the unveiling," she said, her voice booming, Abaddon's words filling the space. "I am the truth," she sought. I raised my crucifix, commanding, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I bind you, Abaddon, and order you to release this woman." The demon laughed, a sound that shook the chamber, and the walls groaned, as if the tunnel itself might collapse. Father Nguyen stepped forward, sprinkling holy water and reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, the story of the Gerasene demoniac, where Christ cast out a legion of spirits. Laura's body convulsed, her eyes rolling back, and the wind became a gale, nearly knocking us off our feet. I continued the rite of exorcism, my voice rising above the storm. "I adjure you, ancient serpent, by the judge of the living and the dead, to depart from this servant of God." The demon's laughter turned to a snarl, and Laura's body lifted slightly, her feet hovering an inch above the ground. The plaque pulsed brighter, its red eyes seeming to burn into my soul, but I held fast, trusting in the authority of Christ. Marcus, his wrists swollen and useless, did something unexpected. He pulled Laura's old recorder from his pocket, a device she had used for her interviews as a journalist. "I found it in her apartment," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. He pressed play, and Laura's voice filled the chamber, not the demon's, but her own, from a recording years ago. She was speaking about her father, her words warm and full of love. "He taught me to ask questions, to never stop seeking the truth, but to always hold on to hope." The sound was a lifeline, a reminder of who Laura was before Abaddon's grip. Her body froze, the vortex slowing, and for a moment her eyes cleared, tears streaming down her face. "Dad," she whispered, her true voice breaking through. The demon roared, enraged by this interruption. The wind surged, and a piece of concrete broke from the ceiling, falling toward Father Nguyen. I shouted a warning, but it was too late. She was struck, collapsing with a cry. Marcus rushed to her, blood pooling beneath her head, and I continued the rite, my heart pounding, but my resolve unbroken. "By the power of Jesus Christ, I command you, Abaddon, to release Laura." I shouted, splashing holy water on the plaque. The red eyes dimmed, and Laura's body slumped, falling to the ground, unconscious but breathing. The wind died, the chamber falling silent, but the cost was heavy. Father Nguyen lay still, her pulse faint, and Marcus, his face ashen, cradled her, praying through his tears. I knelt beside Laura, checking her vitals, and saw the flicker of her true self in her face. The demon's hold was weakened, but not broken. The plaque remained, its presence a lingering threat. We carried Laura and Father Nguyen out of the tunnel, the medical team rushing to help. Father Nguyen was taken to the hospital, her condition critical, and Laura was stabilized, though unresponsive. Marcus, his wrists now useless, refused to leave her side, his faith unshaken despite the horror. I returned to the church, the weight of the night pressing on me, and prayed before the Blessed Sacrament, begging for Father Nguyen's life and Laura's soul. My friends, the abyss had struck a terrible blow, but the battle was not over. The plaque remained, and Abaddon's shadow lingered, Keep Laura and Father Nguyen in your prayers, for the story continues with the final confrontation and the price we paid to close the abyss. Christ's light shines brightest in the darkest moments, and we held fast to that truth. The tunnel chamber was silent as we carried Laura and Father Nguyen to the surface, the air heavy with the aftermath of Abaddon's fury. The medical team, waiting outside the Michigan Central Station, rushed to Father Nguyen's side, their faces grim as they assessed her condition. Blood matted her hair, and her breathing was shallow. A piece of falling concrete had struck her head, and the injury was severe. Laura, unconscious but alive, was placed on a stretcher, her face pale but peaceful for the first time in days. Marcus, his wrists swollen and useless, stayed close, his lips moving in silent prayer, his rosary dangling from his good hand. I followed them to the ambulance, my heart heavy with the weight of what had happened. The plaque remained in the chamber, its red eyes dim but not extinguished, a reminder that Abaddon's hold was not fully broken. At the hospital, the news about Father Nguyen was devastating. The doctors confirmed a traumatic brain injury, and despite their efforts, she slipped into a coma. Her pulse faded hours later, and she passed into God's hands, a martyr to the battle we had fought. I knelt in the hospital chapel, tears streaming down my face, praying for her soul and asking the Blessed Virgin to welcome her into eternal rest. Father Nguyen's sacrifice was a stark reminder of the cost of this ministry. My training in Rome had warned that exorcism is a battlefield and the demonic does not yield without a fight. Yet her courage, her unwavering faith had been a light in the darkness, and I knew she was now with the saints interceding for us. Laura was stabilized, her vitals weak but steady. She remained unconscious, her body exhausted from the ordeal. The doctors could find no physical cause for her condition, but I knew the true battle was spiritual. Marcus, his wrists now in a cast, refused to leave her side, his faith unshaken despite his grief. "She's still in there, Father," he said, his voice breaking. I heard her voice in that recording. "She's fighting." I nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder, and returned to the church to prepare for what must come next. The book we found in the tunnels had been clear. To banish Abaddon fully, the bronze plaque had to be destroyed, and Laura's soul had to be freed through the completion of the exorcism. I contacted the Archdiocese of Detroit, informing them of Father Nguyen's death and the urgent need to finish what we had started. The bishop, shaken by the loss, granted permission to continue, entrusting me with the task of securing the plaque and concluding the rite. I returned to the tunnels alone the next morning, armed with holy water, my crucifix, and the relic of St. Benedict. The air was still, the wind gone, but the chamber felt heavy, as if Abaddon's presence lingered in the shadows. The plaque stood in the center, its red eyes dull but watchful. I prayed the prayer to St. Michael, sprinkled holy water, and wrapped the plaque in a blessed cloth, careful not to touch it. The Archdiocese had arranged for it to be sealed in a consecrated vault, where it could no longer serve as a conduit for evil. Back at the hospital, I resumed the exorcism at Laura's bedside, with Marcus and a deacon from the parish as witnesses. The setting was quieter now, the sterile room a stark contrast to the chaos of the tunnels, but the spiritual battle was no less intense. I began with the litany of the saints, my voice steady, invoking the intercession of Father Nguyen, whose sacrifice, I believe, strengthened our prayers. Laura's body stirred, her eyelids fluttering, and a low growl escaped her lips, not as fierce as before, but a sign that Abaddon was still present. I read from the Gospel of John, chapter 16, verse 33. "In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart. I have overcome the world." The room grew cold, and Laura's hands clenched, but I continued commanding, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I order you, Abaddon, to depart from this woman and return to the abyss from which you came." The demon's resistance was weaker now, its power diminished without the plaque. Laura's body arched once, then relaxed, and her breathing steadied. I sprinkled holy water, and for the first time she did not recoil. Her eyes opened, clear and human, filled with tears. "Father," she whispered, her voice her own, "it's gone." I continued the prayers, ensuring no trace of the demon remained, and placed a blessed medal of St. Benedict around her neck. Marcus wept, his good hand clutching hers, and the deacon joined me in a prayer of thanksgiving. The room felt lighter, as if the weight of the abyss had lifted, and I knew Christ had prevailed. Laura's recovery was slow and painful. When she awoke fully, she could no longer write, her hands trembling whenever she tried to hold a pen, as if Abaddon had taken that gift as a final act of spite. She spoke little of the ordeal, but her eyes carried a quiet strength, a sign that her faith, though shaken, was being rebuilt. Marcus underwent surgery for his wrist, but the damage was permanent. He could no longer work as a mechanic, his livelihood lost to the battle. The Michigan Central Station was sealed off by the city, its tunnels declared unsafe, and the plaque was locked away in a vault at the Archdiocese, blessed and guarded to prevent further harm. The story of Laura became a whispered legend in Detroit. Some claimed to hear her name in the wind near the station, a faint echo of the abyss. I returned to Indianapolis, carrying the weight of Father Nguyen's loss and the memory of that night. I never entered those tunnels again, but I keep a crucifix with me always, a reminder of the battle we fought. Abaddon, the king of the abyss, is a real and ancient evil, preying on those who seek truth without the anchor of faith. Yet, as I learned in Rome, no darkness can withstand the light of Christ, who conquered sin and death. My friends, this story is a call to vigilance. The demonic seeks the cracks in our soul's grief, pride, or despair, and offers false promises of knowledge or power. But we are not alone. The Church, the saints, and the power of Christ stand with us. Keep Laura, Marcus, and Father Nguyen in your prayers, for their sacrifices remind us that even in the abyss, God's mercy triumphs. Let us hold fast to faith, for the wind may whisper, but Christ's voice is eternal.